Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Hope that you are fine. Today we are going to continue our story Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, and let's go and move to chapter number 7. Now, do you remember where we have stopped last chapter? Yes, exactly, when Oliver was sitting on his bed at the Maylies' house, and then he just was about to sleep, and then he noticed something moving behind the window, and when he looked into the window he found the two evil faces that he knew them very much, and then he just closed his eyes and opened it back again, and then when he looked back again to the window they were gone. So he didn't say anything about this night to anyone, and this is actually was where we stopped last chapter. Let's move to slide number 2 in order to go through the main points very quickly before we set our belts to go back for Oliver Twist. Mr. Bumble married Mrs. Courney. Do you remember both of them? Okay. So, and they became, and he became the master of the workhouse. Mr. Bumble had a fight with his wife, and she told him to go and leave the house. Mr. Bumble met monks who wanted to meet Mrs. Bumble or Mrs. Courney to ask her about Oliver's mother. Mrs. Bumble gave monks a gold locket with the name Agnes written on it. He threw the locket into the river. Then he told the Bumbles to forget everything about him and about this night. So, are you ready? Please go and get your storybook. Then open page 32 in order to start our chapter. Here back again to the place where Oliver was born, in the workhouse, and actually there were some changes happened to this house. Mr. Bumble, do you remember Mr. Bumble, the beadle of the parish? Do you remember the meaning of beadle? Yes, exactly, the one who is responsible for the people in the parish, and he was also responsible for punishing the disobeying kids. And you know quite well that the beadle at this time was wearing fine clothes and fine hat, and he always holding a stick in order to punish the disobeying children or the disobeying kids that work in the workhouse. And Mrs. Courney was the matron and the nurse that helped the mother of Oliver Twist to give birth for Oliver, and she also was the person who stole the gold locket out of the mother's neck, and she didn't say anything about this to anyone. Okay, so here back again to this workhouse, and you can find Mr. Bumble and Mrs. Bumble. Now they are married and they are living together at the same house. Now Mrs. Courney is calling Mrs. Bumble according for the name of her husband, and here is the scene of their life. One scene of their life. Mr. Bumble sighed loudly. Please underline the word sigh. To sigh like this. Like this is the sound of sighing. So Mr. Bumble sighed loudly. He wasn't the parish beadle now he was the master of the workhouse, but actually he wasn't very happy because now he is married to, or he was married to Mrs. Bumble, which was very terrible woman. Yes, actually it's a little bit funny the life. Let's see what happened. Mr. Bumble was unhappy, and he had married to the matron of the workhouse, Mrs. Courney, and she now is a bad-tempered, the terrible woman. Suddenly, Mrs. Bumble hurried into the room. She looked at her husband, who was half asleep in his chair and just thinking like this. Then she said with a very loud and sharp voice, "Are you going to sit there all the day without doing anything?" Her voice was a little bit sharp and loud. Then her husband replied, "I shall sit here as long as I like, Mrs. Bumble. Why didn't your first husband teach you to be polite?" Mrs. Bumble gave a loud scream like this. He was saying, and he was insulting her. So she said, "Why did you tell me like this? Why? So Mr. Bumble looked at her and said, "You can cry, Mrs. Bumble. You can cry as much as you can. Now I'm going to leave because I don't care." So she got very angry, and she just returned her strength, and she said, "Okay, then I'll make you care." Please circle the word care. Of course, she will not make him care by good manners. She's going to misbehave, or she's going to hurt him until he got the point that he should care about her. So Mr. Bumble just smiled and stood up and put his hat on. She jumped up from her chair and ran at him. She knocked off Mr. Bumble's hat, knocked off one's hat like this. I'm wearing a hat like this, and someone knocked it, means to make it fall out of my head. And she began hitting him and pulling his hair. Yes, she was pulling his hair. Get out, Mr. Bumble, out of my house. So Mrs. Bumble shouted again, I don't want you here. I don't want to see you again. Mr. Bumble smiled slowly and put his hat again. Are you going? Mrs. Bumble said. Certainly, my dear, certainly, Mr. Bumble answered. I don't want to stay here with you, terrible woman. When I was the beadle, I was respected. And to respect someone means to be good, or people think that you are good, that you are behaving very well. So he said, when I was a beadle, I was respected, and now everyone laughs at me. And he said to himself, now I'm very sad, and my life really piece of miserable as this, because of this woman, this terrible woman. And now Mr. Bumble walked slowly down the street. He went into the inn and bought a drink. There was another man, a stranger. Actually, Mr. Bumble was a curious man, so he just looked at the stranger like this and tried to figure out who was this one. Then the young man looked at Mr. Bumble back carefully, and then he spoke. I have seen you before. Aren't you the beadle of this parish? I was the beadle, Mr. Bumble said sadly. Now I am the master of the workhouse, and then he stopped for a little bit and said, and now I'm a married man. The young man just laughed like this and said, okay, and what's wrong with this? Anyway, no problem. I came here to find you, the young man. I want some information and I'll pay you back the money. And he placed the 2 gold coins on the table for Mr. Bumble. Mr. Bumble took the money quickly and said, I will help you if I can. Okay, so then think back again nearly 12 years, the young man said. It was winter, the time was midnight, the place was the parish workhouse, and the scene was about like this. Do you remember when young woman came with very exhausted case and she was about to give birth for her first child? The woman was a little bit blondie-haired woman, and she was a little bit a stranger from this parish. So Mr. Bumble listened carefully, and then the young man went on. A boy was born at that time. This boy was so weak and ill, and then he stopped. So Mr. Bumble cut the way that they were talking together, and he said quickly, many boys were burned in the workhouse. How can I remember? And many died. Actually, the young man became a little bit aggressive with Mr. Bumble, and he just looked sharply at his eyes and said, let me continue my... Yes, exactly. Let me continue my quote. This boy didn't die. 11 years later, he ran away. His name was... Mr. Bumble cried, no, Oliver Twist? Yes, he was a young villain. I always said that he... The young man said like this, yes, Oliver Twist, and I don't care about your opinion. I don't care what about you always said. I need the boy. I wanted to talk. I need the boy alive. He said, now who can tell me where is the boy? He just ran away. So the young man said again, okay, I wanted to talk to the matron of the workhouse, the matron with the boy's mother that was with the boy's mother at this night. When the mother died, she could take something from the mother, and she kept it with her. So I wanted to talk with this matron or to find her. Mr. Bumble said, okay, I can help you. Now the matron is my wife. I think she has something I want, and please. Then he wrote a note and then gave it back to Mr. Bumble. Now please look at this note, give it back to her, and I am going to wait for both of you today at night. Give your wife this note. If it tells her what I want, there is an address written here in the note. Meet me at this address tomorrow at night at 9 o'clock. I'll give you more money then. But you haven't told me your name, Mr. Bumble. The man was about to go out of the inn, so he turned it back, exactly like the movies, yes? So he turned it back to him and said, Monks. My name is Monks. The next night, as Mr. and Mrs. Bumble went to meet Monks again, there was a terrible storm and the rain was heavy and they soon became very wet. Monk's note had told them to go to an old building by the river. They are going to find the old building, then they are going to knock with the specific way, and then something like the password or something like the key or a clue to open the door for both of them. So when they did so, Monks opened the door at once. He looked at Mrs. Bumble and said, Dear lady, I think you have something for me. He was saying this with an evil smile and evil look as well. Okay, but first, come on. The Bumbles followed Monks into a dark little room. They sat down and then Monks spoke again. Now, madam, nearly 12 years ago, you stole the gold locket. Okay, let me first remind you with the meaning of a locket. Locket here is something like you can wear in a gold chain. With it, you can open it and put inside it a piece of hair, piece of paper, a wedding ring or something, or a picture of someone and so on. So she said, no. I didn't steal it. The girl gave it to me. I was keeping it for the child, for the poor child. But he ran away. If you wanted the locket, you can give me 25 pounds. So Monks was saying, okay, you were keeping it for the boy? Okay, I'm going to give you the money, all the money that you need, but show me the locket first. Mrs. Bumble put a small leather bag on the table. Now give me the money. Now give me the money. Give me the money, please. Monks said, shh, let me see it first. So he opened the bag and took out the gold locket. Monks opened it carefully and looked inside it. Let's see, and please highlight or underline what was inside the locket because it's very important. Please highlight or underline this. 2 pieces of hair and gold wedding ring. The wedding ring here is the ring that you can wear for marriage or engagement or something like this. So there was a wedding ring and 2 pieces of hair inside the gold locket. In the wedding ring there was a name written. The name was Agnes, the name of the lady, and there was also a date. Mrs. Bumble commented on this and she said, you can find the date. The child was born less than a year after this date or that date. It means that the time or the period of time between the date of marriage and the date of birth of Oliver Twist wasn't that long time. So that means that the lady was newly married, and she said that Oliver wasn't so much far was born from this date, the date of marriage. Good, Monks said. He walked to the window and opened it. Below the window was the river, so he just tied the leather bag with a stone, heavy stone, and then he threw them back from the window to the river until they go down to the bottom of the river, and then he turned it back again to the Bumbles and gave them the money, and he said, now, I don't want both of you to remember me. You don't know me, I don't know you. And if I saw you one time or one day, I will ask you who were you. Now go quickly. So both of them got out of the house, and this was the end of chapter 7. Let's see what we are having here for the oral questions in order to link all the events or the ideas of chapter 7 together. Number 1, what happened to Mr. Bumble when he got married to Mrs. Courney? He became disappointed. His life became very miserable. Where did Mr. Bumble meet Monks? He met him at the inn. What did Mr. Bumble say to his wife when she was crying? He says to her, cry as much as you can, but I don't care. Who did Mr. Bumble meet at the inn? Of course, Monks. What did Monks do with the gold locket? He just tied the leather bag with the heavy stone and threw them out of the window to the river. Where did the Bumbles meet the young man? They met him at the old house. Describe the young man at the inn. Of course, you are going to write the description of monks. Now let's go for slide number 4 for the main questions. Are you going to sit there all the day? Mrs. Bumble asked. I shall sit here as long as I like, Mrs. Bumble, her husband said. Why didn't your first husband teach you to be polite? Mrs. Bumble gave a loud scream, and she was a little bit surprised with these sharp words. Then she sat down and began to cry. Mr. Bumble smiled and he said, okay, now it's fine to cry, you evil woman. And he stood up and put on his hat. You can cry, Mrs. Bumble. Cry as much as you like. I don't care. Then, okay, I'll make you care. Mrs. Bumble cried out for him, replying to his words, and she jumped up from her chair, ran to him. She knocked out the hat of Mr. Bumble, and she tried to pull the hair of Mr. Bumble, and she tried to just beat him like this, and it was, of course, a scene of a comedy movie. Now let's back again to the questions. What did Mr. Bumble say to his wife when she was crying, and why? He said to her, cry as much as you like, I don't care, because she talked to him in impolite way and she was always saying bad words to him. Are you going to sit there all the day? Mrs. Brownlow said these words. No, actually, it's not Mrs. Brownlow. You have here something mistaken our presentation. Please, I want all of you to concentrate. This quote said by Mrs. Bumble, not Mrs. Brownlow. Mrs. Bumble said these words to her husband when he was sitting on his chair, not doing anything, and he was about to sleep. So Mrs. Bumble entered the room and she said to him these words. Describe what happened when Mr. Bumble said, cry as much as you can or as you like. I don't care, Mrs. Bumble. Mrs. Bumble jumped up from her chair and ran to her husband. She knocked off his hat and she tried to begin hitting him and pulling his hair and screaming like this and so on. Now moving to slide number 6. Why did Vagan send Oliver to the house of Chertsey? This is actually the slide that we are going to concentrate on these 2 points because they are very important to help Toby and Sykes in the robbery to be a thief. And actually this was the end of chapter 6 and 7 that we have stopped here. We have stopped at Mr. Bumble and Mrs. Bumble, and there we stopped at Oliver Twist. These are the 2 scenes that you should remember them for the next chapter. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being with you, and I'm going to meet you back again on chapter number 8.